to go through prepositions now, and they're somewhat of a unique part of speech in that defining them is quite difficult. They don't have such a clear definition as a noun or a verb, an adjective or an adverb. It's really hard to say what one is, and I've looked through a number of grammar books, and they don't really have great definitions. So I'll try to give you my best definition, but honestly I'll tell you, don't worry too much about it. Worry more about what the prepositional phrase is going to do. That's what's going to be important. Really what it does is it relates a noun to another noun or to a verb. That's what it does. It is essentially, if you remember from one of the first times I spoke about these, they're essentially much like conjunctions. They work in much the same way. But what they do is they take a noun and they're going to relate it in one way or another to another noun or to a verb. That's what they're going to do. They don't really have a good definition beyond that. But what they create and what they do is extremely important. They set up a prepositional phrase. This is what's essential about prepositions, is they set up the prepositional phrase. They're the first word in the prepositional phrase. Now the words themselves are the words that you're very familiar with, but oddly enough they're oftentimes very difficult to define. Words such as over, on, under, or of. You might think of how could you define of? Or how do you define many of the prepositions without using those prepositions in the definition? It's pretty difficult to do so, but it can be done. But what they really do is they relate. Whatever noun is at the end of that prepositional phrase, they're going to take that noun and give it some type of relation either to another noun or to a verb. So that's what they do. They set up some kind of relationship. Okay? So there is a very long list of prepositions. And I would not say it's important to memorize that list. In fact, I wouldn't. There's anywhere, depending on whose count you're following, anywhere from 50 to 100 of them. But you do want to be very familiar with it. And so what I've given you is a drill sheet so you can go through the prepositions, get used to them, not so you can memorize them, but so that when you see them, you could recognize them and go, okay, that's a preposition. It's probably got a noun coming up pretty soon. That's what you want to be able to do. You don't need to memorize them. You just need to be very, very familiar with them so you can pick up on them when you want to use them or when you see them in another person's writing or in your own writing to know how they're functioning and what they're setting up. Okay? So get very familiar with that list I've given you, which includes about 56 prepositions. Again, the list could go on up to about 100 words. There's probably even more than that. But get to the point where you're very familiar with them, because they are some of the most common words in the English language. Again, because they set up what is going to be very important, the prepositional phrase. Now, a couple things on why you must get familiar with them. And at first it's going to seem like, well, then I don't need to worry about them too much, but you're going to find they're absolutely essential to writing well. The first thing to know is that they cannot be the subject or verb of the sentence. They cannot be the subject or verb of a sentence. They can't do that in any way, manner, or form. They cannot do that. Instead, what they're always going to do is modify either a noun or they're going to modify a verb. And they're going to set up that modification. You might recognize some of that definition is a lot like the definition of an adjective or an adverb. In fact, what prepositional phrases do is to function as adjectives or adverbs. What prepositions are going to do is they're going to set up that prepositional phrase, and then that prepositional phrase is going to function as either an adjective or an adverb. And adjectives and adverbs are not essential to a subject and verb. If you remember from the original chart I gave you, nouns and verbs are the most essential to meaning. Adjectives and adverbs really provide detail and color and nuance to those nouns and verbs. And what prepositional phrases are going to do, along with conjunctions, they're going to set up relationships within it. And one of the relationships they do is they set up that noun to turn into a modification of another noun or of a verb. So what prepositions do is they don't carry much meaning at all. What they do is create a prepositional phrase, and that prepositional phrase functions as an adjective or as an adverb. Okay, so again, not much meaning in and of themselves. Really, it sets up a relationship. That's what they do. And if you look at good writing, good, clear, professional level writing, educated writing, and I'm not talking about advanced writing, say, PhD level. We're talking about capable professional writers, which is what everybody in this class should want to become. Their writing will be composed of anywhere between 1/3 to 1/2 prepositional phrases. About 1/3 to 1/2 of their writing will be composed of prepositional phrases, which means that prepositions are playing an extremely important role in creating that specificity and that precision in their writing. So that's why they're going to be so important. They're not important for the meaning, but for what they do is set up that detail that you need. If you look at this example of a sentence, I have here, one of my cousins threw a great party on Friday. One of my cousins threw a great party on Friday. Now, in Chapter 3, we're going to get more into subjects and verbs, but I want you to see this and see what the prepositional phrases do. There are 2 prepositional phrases in here. And they are, of my cousins and on Friday. So, of my cousins and on Friday. Now, the one thing you can always do is take the prepositional phrases out of a sentence, and that sentence should still function. It won't have as much detail, but it will make sense. So it will lack the detail, but it should make sense on its own, because it still has its basic subject and verb. Okay? So I could say, one threw a great party. If you know I'm talking about my cousins, and you know it was on Friday, you'll know what I'm talking about. That's assuming that the listener has a lot more context. In writing, your reader will not have as much context as the listener will. So in writing, it's more important to be more detailed with your sentences. And the best way to get more detailed is use prepositions to set up prepositional phrases. And so this really defines, of my cousins, it really describes the one. That's what it does. It takes this pronoun one and it provides more detail about it. It's not one of my friends, okay, or one of my associates, or one of my brothers. It's one of my cousins. It's describing the one. That's what it's doing, okay? On Friday is a prepositional phrase. It's telling you when. And words that are generally words that tell you when something happens, that's an adverb. So the whole phrase on Friday is functioning as an adverb to tell you when the party was thrown. Notice that with adverbs, you might recall that they can be moved. Notice I can move on Friday. On Friday, one of my cousins threw a great party. I can move the on Friday to the beginning, or I can move it to the end. Adverbs have that ability. This on is the preposition, and it set up the prepositional phrase on Friday. This of is the preposition, and it set up the prepositional phrase of my cousins. In this case, and in all prepositional phrases, it starts with a preposition, ends with a noun. Starts with a preposition and ends with a noun. That's what they do. Prepositional phrases always start with the preposition and then they end with the noun. You don't generally get prepositions standing by themselves. Instead, what they're doing is setting up that relationship between this noun and this one over here. Between this noun and this verb. That's what they do, is they set up that relationship. Notice this one's an adjective, it can't move. It has to be tied to the one. This one's functioning as an adverb, it can move around. So the preposition sets up the prepositional phrase that ends with a noun. Once again, the preposition sets up the prepositional phrase that ends with a noun. So that's what prepositions do. They set it up, and then they run until they hit that noun. A prepositional phrase can be anywhere from 2 words all the way up to 10 words or even more. In the vast majority of cases, a prepositional phrase is from 2 to 5 words. 2 to 5 words. That's where most prepositional phrases are. They're between 2 to 5 words. They can go longer, but that doesn't happen very often. So prepositions are not important in and of themselves because they don't give much meaning. But what they do is they set up prepositional phrases which give detail. Because in the end, those prepositional phrases function as adjectives or as adverbs. So you want to get very good at recognizing prepositions and knowing how to use them. As you go through your writing, oftentimes in your early drafts, you won't have much detail in them. In the latter drafts, if you want to add more detail, you don't necessarily add more words, individual words. Try using prepositions to set up prepositional phrases to give more detail. If you operate with the idea that you can add phrases, whole phrases, prepositional phrases, you'll have an easier time adding much more detail to your writing. Okay? Take care.